Hey guys, if you were expecting the world to end with a bang, a final scream, a last trumpet, or at the very least a decent fireworks display, I'm sorry to disappoint you. The end is never theatrical. It doesn't kick down the door in a blaze of fury and symbolism. It doesn't bring closure or catharsis or even good lighting. It arrives quietly, with a whisper, with silence, with cold. The kind of cold that doesn't knock. It seeps into your bones, your mind, your inbox. The kind that doesn't arrive with urgency but with resignation. Like an old friend who's overstayed their welcome, or a bill-marked final notice that you already knew was coming. It starts with days that forget how to end, with mornings that slip through the cracks of your routine like a question no one knows how to answer. It starts with people who stop looking at the sky, not because it's cloudy, but because it hasn't looked back in years. A stillness that's not peaceful, just exhausted. The kind of quiet that feels too heavy to be natural. The Vikings had a word for it. Fimbulwinter. A great winter. An eternal winter. A prelude to collapse so relentless, even the sun forgets its route. We, of course, in our modern brilliance, call it something else. We call it Monday. And if you're still listening, wrapped in a blanket that doesn't quite reach your feet, letting your coffee cool while the snow falls quietly outside your mind, consider subscribing. Not because it'll stop the frost from spreading, but because some stories deserve to be heard all the way to the end. Especially the ones that feel eerily familiar. The ones that echo in your chest even though you've never heard them out loud. The ones that sound less like fiction and more like something you dreamed, and then tried to forget. Fimbulwinter was the prelude to Ragnarok, the Viking apocalypse, but not the Instagrammable version with fire and lightning and last-minute redemption arcs. This wasn't a season finale with a satisfying twist. This was entropy. This was collapse by neglect. No sun. No spring, no release, just an endless loop of gray. A world so tired it couldn't even summon the energy to scream. For 3 years straight, the sky remained silent, not out of mystery, but out of pure, frozen fatigue. Even the gods, those celestial influences of fate, just logged off. Not with a bang, but with the shrug of an immortal who's seen it all and knows the sequel will be worse. Imagine Odin, the All-Father, sitting in his great hall like a CEO who just got out of yet another soul-crushing quarterly meeting. One eye staring into the void, the other scrolling through humanity's latest flops. Thor, pacing with Mjolnir in hand, not to strike, but out of restlessness. Frustrated, bored. The storm has passed, but the emptiness lingers. Loki, lounging in the back like the intern who knows the servers are about to crash but has no incentive to stop it. The gods weren't enraged. They were done. Even divinity has a burnout threshold. And what triggered it all? Not a betrayal. Not an explosion. Not even a dramatic prophecy carved into stone. Just the slow, painful unraveling of things once taken for granted. Fenrir, the great wolf, yawned wider than usual. The divine chains holding him didn't snap. They slipped, like a to-do list left unchecked. Jormungandr, the world serpent, began stirring in the ocean's depths, not to destroy, but because even he couldn't stay still anymore. The sun started missing its shifts. The moon called in sick and never came back. And nobody noticed. Or worse, everybody noticed, but assumed it wasn't their problem. Because the end didn't look like chaos. It looked like routine. Like beige offices and default passwords and existential dread tucked neatly between scheduled meetings. Like the uncanny repetition of "I'm fine" echoing through frozen smiles. And meanwhile, humans, oh, humans, were still at it, arguing over whose god had the better beard, hoarding what didn't belong to them, inventing new ways to feel personally attacked by truths carved into stone long before their existence. They hadn't missed the signs. They just didn't care anymore. The snow didn't stop falling. The birds didn't come back. The crops whispered their final goodbyes. But instead of mourning, people turned up the volume, turned on the lights, and told themselves it was just a phase. And so, the wolves crept closer. Fenrir didn't charge into battle. He didn't roar. He didn't need to. He wandered, quietly, unstoppable, not because he was violent, but because he was inevitable. The apocalypse was patient. That's the trick. That's the cruelty. The end doesn't need to chase you. It knows we'll get there eventually, all on our own. Ragnarok isn't what you think. It's not gods clashing in cinematic glory. It's not the heavens splitting open like overripe fruit. It's trust breaking, systems failing. It's the quiet cracking of something you thought was eternal. Even Yggdrasil, the great tree that held the cosmos, began to tremble. Not from an enemy's blow, but from exhaustion. From bearing the weight of everything and being thanked with graffiti and axe wounds. And in the end, everyone fought. Because that's what myth demands. Odin rode into battle knowing he would fall. Thor killed the serpent only to drown in its venom. Heimdall and Loki tore each other apart, not for justice, but for closure. This was never about victory. It was about finishing what had already been foretold. A divine performance review with no survivors. But buried in the blood and frost was something else. Something smaller, quieter, stranger than survival. Two humans, Lif and Lithrasir, who didn't fight, who didn't save anyone, who didn't post about their struggle or write poems in the ash. They hid. They waited. They breathed when breathing felt absurd. They ate dew-off roots. They didn't change the world. They simply remained in it. Not with fire. Not with power. With presence. Maybe that's the real prophecy. Not that life wins, but that life insists. That after everything collapses, something still stirs. That the smallest things, a heartbeat, a whisper, a hand held in silence, are the ones that truly survive. And isn't that what we feel now? Like we're already in the long twilight of something that doesn't have a name? Like we're not waiting for the end. We're living in it? The climate shifts, the headlines burn, the leaders bark, and yet we go to work. We refresh the feed. We light candles in the dark. We fall asleep to stories about cold gods and ancient winters, because somehow that's easier than facing the heat we've built with our own hands. Ragnarok isn't fiction. It's reflection. Ragnarok isn't a myth. It's a mirror. Not a tale from long ago, but a warning written in present tense. The wolves may look different now, hunger disguised as ambition, greed rebranded as innovation, artificial intelligence with gods in their code and no soul to weigh them down, but the pattern remains. The apocalypse doesn't always come with flames and screams. Sometimes it's quieter, slower, bureaucratic. It shows up in the fine print. In the shrug of an overwhelmed system, something ancient breaks, something overlooked survives. And through it all, the snow keeps falling, soft as ash, cold as silence. So close your eyes. The world won't end tonight. It'll just forget to begin again. Not with a bang, but with a buffering icon. Not with gods clashing in the sky, but with 1,000 unread emails piling up while no one feels alive enough to answer them. They say the gods are gone, but maybe they're just watching, from behind burnt-out clouds and cracked marble skies, wondering how we managed to make the same mistakes with better tools. There's a strange comfort in imagining that even Odin got tired, that even Thor eventually had to put the hammer down, not in triumph, but in resignation. Not because the world was saved, but because there's only so many times you can rebuild a house that insists on burning itself down before breakfast. We like our gods loud, decisive, efficient. We want thunder. We want miracles on demand. We want someone to answer the customer service hotline of existence, preferably before lunch. But Ragnarok wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. A final update with no option to cancel. A reboot hidden in runes, elegant and inevitable. Not punishment, process. Not failure, design. It didn't come to destroy. It came to reset. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth we've spent centuries ignoring. That endings aren't bugs. They are features. That sometimes, the holiest thing you can do is let everything fall apart, without trying to tape it back together. The gods didn't die because they were weak. They died because they got comfortable. Because they mistook control for wisdom. Because they stopped evolving, and the universe doesn't care how many temples you build if you forget how to listen. Meanwhile, humanity clung to rituals that had long since lost their meaning. To fires that wouldn't start. To kings who stammered prophecies between tax hikes. And when the sky finally split and the wolves howled back, no one was ready. Not because they weren't warned, but because they thought warnings were for other people. Less civilized people. Less online. We believed prophecy was beneath us, and so we walked directly into it. The battlefield wasn't a field at all. It was everywhere. It was in the silence between two people scrolling in the same bed. In the algorithmic static of endless news feeds. In the slow erosion of kindness, traded for cleverness. In the elevation of certainty over curiosity, performance over substance. And as the myths replayed themselves, this time in pixels and hashtags, the old gods returned not as saviors, but as expired metaphors no one could quite delete. Somewhere, deep beneath the frost-bitten surface, Yggdrasil still holds on. Barely. Its roots cracked, its branches scorched, its bark tattooed with the graffiti of centuries, but alive. Not because it's magical, but because something in its bones refuses to surrender. Not yet. Not while breath still fogs the air in some forgotten corner of the world. Not while two human beings still whisper to each other in the dark, sharing warmth like contraband. And maybe that's the point. Maybe survival was never about conquest. Maybe it's about becoming smaller, softer, less certain. Maybe it's not about gods or monsters at all, but about the gentle defiance of life in places no one thinks to look. Not in palaces or temples, but in the cracks of broken walls. In the moss that insists on growing. In the breath that doesn't need applause to matter. There's no prophecy left. No flaming sword. No booming voice from above. Only echoes, but even echoes can teach, if we're quiet long enough to hear them. If we can stop mistaking movement for progress. If we can remember how to simply exist without a broadcast. Somewhere in the wreckage, the seeds are already growing. Quietly, rudely, without asking permission. Because life isn't polite. It just happens. Especially when no one's watching. And maybe that's what the gods never understood. You can't choreograph rebirth. You can't schedule healing. You can't demand resilience. You can only endure long enough to recognize it when it shows up in the form of something messy and mortal. Rebirth doesn't come with a soundtrack. It comes with discomfort, with awkward beginnings and clumsy attempts at new rituals. So if you wake tomorrow and nothing makes sense, take comfort. That means it's working. That means the code is rewriting itself. That means the frost is melting, even if you can't see it yet. That means the wolves have passed, for now. But don't get comfortable. Ragnarok, after all, was never meant to be a single event. It's a cycle, a pulse, a whisper from the edge of the map that says, everything burns, everything freezes, everything ends, and then something starts. There's something unnerving about how quiet rebirth is. It doesn't roar. It doesn't come with press conferences. It seeps in, shy, cautious, like a memory you're not sure is yours. The snow doesn't melt all at once. It recedes, then hesitates, like trauma unsure if it's allowed to stop repeating itself. Like grief unsure if it's safe to breathe. Lif and Lithrasir don't make speeches. They don't ride into the sunrise with banners and violins. They are dirty, starving, barely holding on. They didn't survive because they were chosen. They survived because they stayed still. Because when the world screamed, they listened. Because when everything burned, they hid, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Because silence can be louder than defiance. That's the kind of heroism sagas don't celebrate. Quiet endurance. The discipline of staying when everything else collapses. The fragile strength of building something new with hands that remember too much. We want legends. We want explosions. We want gods to rise. But sometimes, salvation looks like two people sharing a broken loaf of bread in the ruins of a better plan. Maybe that's the lesson Ragnarok was always trying to whisper, and we were too busy shouting to hear it. That the world doesn't need another savior. It needs someone who stays, who plants, who waits, who doesn't demand recognition, who just breathes and keeps breathing long enough for the frost to forget it was ever permanent. And in that silence, in that aching simplicity, something begins again. The gods had their turn, their weapons, their glory, their catalogue of mistakes etched in gold and hubris. They built temples out of arrogance and empires out of denial. And when their stories ended, and they always do, it wasn't with applause, or ascension, or a final, noble sacrifice. No, it was with frost. With falling ash that didn't ask for permission. With silence so thick it felt like the earth itself exhaling for the first time in millennia. A long, drawn-out sigh that sounded suspiciously like a planet saying, finally. But because we are the most persistent creatures in the universe, persistent, or perhaps just pathologically nostalgic, we started over. Again. Here we are, writing myths in new fonts, manufacturing significance out of spreadsheets and supply chains, digging through rubble for meaning like archaeologists with Wi-Fi, building new systems out of the same old wreckage, convinced that this time, yes, this time, it'll be different. That we've learned something. That the mirror reflects a wiser species. And yet the seeds of Ragnarok are already in the soil. They grow beneath parking lots and pop-up ads. They bloom in boardrooms and burn under headlines. Every empire we praise. Every algorithm we obey. Every time we call destruction progress, because it comes with a sleek logo and next-day delivery. The apocalypse doesn't arrive on horseback anymore. It ships free with Prime. Because maybe we don't need a god to destroy us. Maybe we've become quite good at it ourselves. Efficient, even, ruthless. The monsters aren't chained in the underworld anymore. They're in timelines, in policies, in the terms and conditions nobody reads. And they don't need to break free. We let them in. We welcomed them, brushed their teeth, designed logos, gave them corporate sponsorships and a cheerful jingle. Fenrir was just a prototype. Loki was just a beta test. The real chaos was always us, politely applauding as the world cracked. And the saddest part? Even if the world ended again tomorrow, skies cracked, oceans boiled, someone finally noticed the serpent coiled around the planet's spine, we'd still try to Monetize it. Sell tickets. Launch a line of apocalypse-themed merchandise. Ragnarok, now streaming. Binge the end while supplies last. Limited edition. #blessed. But somewhere, always, someone won't play along. Someone will step out of the queue. Turn off the screen. Leave the group chat. Plant something small and stubborn. Hold someone's hand with no intention of letting go. Sleep without recording it. Cry without branding it. That's what saves us. That's what keeps the frost from arriving too soon. The quiet defiance of soft humans in a loud world. It's never the loud ones who rebuild. It's the ones who've learned to listen to silence without panicking. The ones who can sit with the ache of uncertainty and not rush to label it. The ones who know that surviving is not a performance. It's not a TED Talk. It's a practice. Repeated. Imperfect. Sacred in its refusal to give up. So when the sky turns gray again, and it will, remember this. The gods didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they refused to change. Because they fell in love with their own myths. Because they couldn't imagine a world that didn't revolve around their thunder and glory. They wrote their names in stone and forgot that even mountains erode. You, however, are under no such delusion. You don't need a throne or a hammer or a prophecy. You don't need to be chosen. You just need to know when to go quiet, when to stay, when to move, and when to stop pretending you're not scared. Because you are. And that's okay. That's not weakness. That's memory. That's the body remembering what the mind keeps trying to forget. That even in the coldest myth, warmth is still possible. Still waiting. Still human. You just have to stop waiting for the gods to bring it back. Maybe that's what gods were always meant to be. Not rulers. Not saviors. Not cosmic landlords. Just projections. Divine placeholders for the responsibilities we didn't want. War? That's ours. Thunderstorms? Talk to Thor. Jealousy. Fire. Chaos. Death? All conveniently outsourced. Olympus was a convenient scapegoat. So we never had to grow up, never had to own our mess. But eventually, even the best metaphors get tired. They fray. They wrinkle around the edges. They forget their lines. And when you squint long enough at a fading god, what you really start to see is yourself. Tired, flawed, beautiful in the way ruins are beautiful. Desperate for someone else to have the plan. Still hoping the sky might answer. Spoiler, it won't. That's the secret no one tells you about Ragnarok. It's not about divine justice or sacred vengeance or the final battle between good and evil. It's about the slow, excruciating collapse of excuses. The uncomfortable moment when the heavens go quiet and you realize no one is coming. And the silence doesn't mean the end. It means it's your turn. The frost never cared for architecture. It took temples and cottages with the same slow breath. Thrones crumbled like vertebrae. Golden halls collapsed into the mud. Selfies with gods turned into forgotten files on dead clouds. No one was spared, not the righteous, not the powerful, not the influencers with curated faith. The only ones who made it through were the ones who stopped waiting to be saved. And what comes after? Not glory, not a Netflix reboot. Just mud, just seeds, just the long, awkward silence of something new trying to remember how to be alive. The kind of beginning that isn't cinematic. It's just necessary. It's just real. We always imagine the future as a clean slate. But it's not. It's a stained tablecloth no one had the heart to throw away. We don't build on nothing. We build on the rubble of intentions. On the debris of myths we outgrew but still quote at weddings. That's not failure. That's human. Beautiful. Even. We're not here to be perfect. We're here to try again. Against logic. Against odds. Against algorithms. The gods, for all their lightning and prophecy, never really learned how to hold the world once they were done breaking it. That takes a different kind of strength. A strength with no audience. No soundtrack. Just hands in the dirt. Just lungs breathing unevenly. Just eyes that still bother to look up, even when the sky is silent. We live in echoes now, not because the stories are gone, but because we've absorbed them. We carry Ragnarok in our bones, not as doom, but as blueprint. A reminder that endings aren't failures. They're openings. They're step one. Still, we fear it. We fear the pause. We cling to the old myths like life vests, even when they're soggy and sinking. We pretend our buildings will last forever. That our systems are too sleek to shatter. That our stories are too charming to end. As if permanence was ever part of the deal. But the frost doesn't hate us. It's not malicious. It doesn't have a villain arc. It's just indifferent. It doesn't care what we built. Only whether we noticed when it started to melt. Only whether we remembered how to feel the ground again. After so many years suspended in delusion. So let it melt. Let the world be soft. Let the ground quake beneath something new. Let go of the apocalypse you were promised. The one with fire and thunder and judgment. That ending was never meant to save you. It was only ever meant to end. And what you do after that, that's not mythology. That's choice. That's yours. Choice is the one thing even the gods didn't have. For all their power, their stories were already chiseled into the walls of time before their first breath. Not in ink, not in prophecy, but in something colder. Harder. The stillness of inevitability. Odin wasn't just wise. He was trapped in that wisdom, a prisoner of all the endings he already foresaw. Thor didn't just swing his hammer. He swung it knowing each blow was an echo of the last. Loki didn't just lie. He performed a role written in the margins of someone else's tragedy, with no script change allowed. They weren't free. They were curated, stylized, branded myths playing their assigned roles on a stage too ancient to renovate. They had followers, temples, statues, but not choice. And in the end, what's the point of immortality if you can't improvise? But you are not carved in marble. Not yet. You are still smudged in pencil, in the shaky lines of a child's drawing left on the fridge too long. You are still erasable, still becoming, still sketching who you might be on napkins and the backs of receipts. You get to choose whether this moment is your finale, or just an awkward rehearsal in bad lighting with your shoes on the wrong feet. It's tempting, isn't it? To romanticize collapse, to dress it up in opera and storm clouds. We love our apocalypses neat. We love our pain choreographed. But real endings are never so kind. They come not with fire, but with buffering, with unread emails, with the sudden realization that no one remembered your birthday, that your favorite cafe is now a vape shop, that the world doesn't end in screams, but in slowly being forgotten by it. Ragnarok might not look like a battlefield this time. It might look like unpaid invoices, like a climate graph no one understands, like scrolling past starving children because you're late for a meeting. The apocalypse doesn't need horns or fanfare anymore. It just needs your indifference. And that's the sharpest sword of all. But here's the thing, we're still here. By accident, maybe, by inertia, but here nonetheless. Breathing, doubting, pretending we know how to be human while secretly Googling how to be human. Which means, somehow, the story hasn't closed its book yet. The ink's still wet. The narrator's still stalling. And that's a kind of hope. Maybe not the heroic kind. Not the trumpet blasting, banner waving kind. But the kind that wears slippers and boils water and texts "Did you get home okay?" at 2 a.m. The kind of hope that doesn't expect applause. It just wants you to eat something today. Let's be honest. We don't need saviors. We don't need perfect people in perfect poses with glowing swords and cryptic slogans. We've had enough of that. What we need are flawed, scared, painfully average people who still try, who still get up, who still cry in supermarket aisles and then hold the door open for someone on the way out. We need those who choose kindness even when no one's looking. Especially when no one's looking. Because that's what myths forgot. That greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up. Sometimes it's not burning down the world when you have every reason to. Sometimes it's baking bread in a broken oven and offering it anyway. The new world, the one whispering beneath the frost, won't be forged in legend. It will be built with shaky hands. By people who say, "I don't know what I'm doing," and do it anyway. By people who plant seeds in ash because hope, as it turns out, is both illogical and contagious. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. No medals will be given. No songs will be written. You won't trend. You won't be canonized. But someone, years from now, might sit under a tree you planted and feel safe. And they'll never know your name, but they'll feel the echo of your staying. So stay, even when it's easier to vanish. Stay, even when the frost bites deeper. Stay, because you don't need a prophecy. You don't need a god to validate your worth. You don't need a narrator to wrap this all up with a lesson. You are the lesson. You are what remains when everything else leaves. You are the quiet breath in the middle of the storm. You are the soft still here that follows every it's over. And if you're tired, rest. If you're broken, sit beside others who are too. If you're lost, light a match, not to burn things down, but to remind yourself that warmth is still possible. The frost is real. The wolves are loud. The gods are gone. But so what? So are you. And that changes everything. So are you. And that changes everything. Because sometimes, the end of the world is just the prologue. And if you're still here, breathing, blinking, suspiciously scrolling at 3:12 a.m., maybe it's time we told another story. Not one carved in frost or sung by dying gods, but one so ancient it forgot how to die. A story older than prophecy, older than apocalypse, older than every language we forgot how to feel. Let's go back, further than myth, further than scripture, to a time when writing wasn't done with keyboards, but with carved obsidian and borrowed breath. To a place where kings were gods, and gods were deeply insecure. Let me tell you about a man. Not just any man. A man who was 2/3 divine and entirely exhausting. A man who ruled a city so beautiful, even its bricks had an attitude problem. A man who built walls so high, not even his own humility could climb them. His name was Gilgamesh. And if you think you've met complicated men before, wait until you meet the first one who tried to outrun death, and accidentally invented legacy instead. Picture this. A city so old its foundations whisper in cuneiform. So grand, its walls stretch like the ego of the man who built them. This was Uruk, a jewel of baked clay and celestial envy, where the rivers bowed, and time pretended to pass more slowly, out of respect or resignation. And there, at the center of it all, sat Gilgamesh, 2/3 god, 1/3 man, 0% chill. He didn't rule Uruk, he performed it. Every street was his runway, every prayer, his playlist, every triumph, his birthright. Or so he believed. The tablets don't lie, and neither do the citizens whose knees had grown raw from kneeling. They called him king, but not always with affection. Gilgamesh had a habit of confusing leadership with dominance. And his divine blood? Let's just say it went straight to his head and skipped the empathy department. He didn't sleep much. Great men rarely do. Too busy dreaming in architecture, seducing brides before their wedding nights. Not because he needed love, but because he needed to remind the stars who the real celestial body was. If arrogance were a currency, Gilgamesh would have single-handedly caused inflation. He walked like the gods owed him interest. And maybe they did, because while other mortals prayed, he posed. While others aged, he brooded. Wrath was his cologne. Destiny, his chew toy. The walls of Uruk were his crown. Massive, mathematical, immortal, or so he thought. But the thing about walls is, they always say more about the builder than the enemy. And Gilgamesh? He wasn't keeping people out. He was keeping something in. Himself. Maybe. His people were exhausted. Not by famine, nor plague, nor enemy siege. but by the weight of worshipping someone who didn't know the difference between divinity and dictatorship. The farmers whispered. The elders sighed. Even the priests started double-checking if maybe this was the apocalypse. So they prayed. Not for rain, not for harvest, but for balance. For something, someone, to humble the hurricane with a heartbeat. To bring thunder's twin. A counterweight. A mirror sharp enough to make even Gilgamesh blink. And because the gods are petty but fair, they listened. With the amused cruelty of artists sculpting chaos from clay. From the dust of wilderness, sweat of beasts, and silence of stars, they mold something primal. Something untamed. Something that smelled like thunder before it hits. His name would be Enkidu, but we'll get to him later. For now, Gilgamesh still reigned, the drama king of Uruk, throwing banquets for his own shadow, winning battles that didn't exist, searching for immortality in his own reflection. Every myth has its moment before the mirror cracks. Every empire has that eerie stillness before the first stone shifts. For Gilgamesh, that moment came not with a scream, but a whisper in the reeds, a rustle in the wilderness, the sound of something unnameable waking up. He didn't notice it, of course. Narcissism has terrible hearing. He was too busy sculpting new laws, rewriting history, and seducing time itself with his cheekbones. But somewhere beneath the marble, the clay began to stir. The city watched, not with torches or revolution, not yet, but with the quiet defiance of those who've learned that storms always burn themselves out eventually. Even divine ones. Especially divine ones. Meanwhile, Gilgamesh carved poems into temple walls, about himself, naturally. Every conquest got a stanza. Every stair became legend. If journaling was therapy, he needed several tablets a day. But you could feel it, couldn't you? The hairline fracture in the myth. The almost unspoken dread that maybe, just maybe, gods made in man's image weren't so divine after all. That power without limits becomes noise. That even perfection gets boring. And still, he walked. Through gardens so symmetrical they insulted nature. Past statues of himself so lifelike they almost sighed. Toward a future he believed he owned, wrapped in prayers no one meant anymore. Gilgamesh didn't fear death. Not yet. That would come later. What he feared was being forgotten. His entire empire, every brick and bedpost, was a monument against the entropy he couldn't name. A tantrum against time. But legacy built on fear is always fragile. And kings who scream into eternity often find themselves answered, not by applause, but by silence. Or worse, by someone equally loud. So when the first rumor of a wild man reached Uruk, a creature born of dust and dreams, Gilgamesh didn't worry. He smiled, because only a fool mistakes an echo for a threat. And Gilgamesh? He'd already made peace with one truth. No one could rival him. Except, of course, someone who didn't want to. And that was the beginning of the end. Before he had a name, he had a scent. Rain-soaked fur and wind-blown dust. Enkidu wasn't born. He was conjured. Summoned by a desperate prayer and a divine eye-roll. Sculpted not from marble or ambition, but from the raw clay of enough is enough. He didn't arrive in robes or lightning. He arrived naked. Hair like the wilderness, eyes like something that had never blinked before. He was everything Gilgamesh wasn't. and exactly what the story needed. Not a warrior, not a god, not yet, just breath, bone, and the unsettling grace of someone too wild to be afraid. Animals didn't flee from him. They recognized him, ran beside him, drank with him, shared shade and silence with him. Enkidu was their brother, not by birth, but by rhythm. His heartbeat aligned with hooves. His thoughts curled like vines. He didn't speak in words. He understood. And so the forest loved him. The earth, too. He left no scars when he walked. No crops trampled. No egos bruised. Just quiet, feral balance. But the gods hadn't made him to keep things in place. They made him to interrupt, to irritate, to throw the divine equivalent of a wrench into Gilgamesh's perfectly polished gears. Enter Shamhat. Not a goddess, not a warrior, a priestess of Ishtar, fluent in the language of seduction and subtle sabotage. She didn't carry weapons. She carried wine, honeyed words, the scent of civilization on skin. Her mission? To civilize the beast. Or, depending on your angle, to ruin him. She found Enkidu beside the watering hole, content and unclothed, blissfully unaware that humanity was about to happen to him. She didn't attack. She smiled. She spoke softly. She let her silk fall. And Enkidu, curious and unafraid, stepped closer. They say it lasted 6 days. Some say 7. Honestly, it wasn't about numbers. It was about transformation. Each kiss rewrote his instincts. Each touch softened his wildness. By the end, the animals no longer greeted him. They looked at him like a stranger, like a mistake. And just like that, Eden ended. He tried to return to the wild, but the wild had already forgotten him. That's what civilization does, not with war, but with invitation. With pillows, with baked bread, with the slow, irreversible comfort of being seen. Shamhat gave him food, real food, salted, cooked, crafted. The kind of food that made your stomach growl and your soul sign a lease. She clothed him in woven fabric, named him, told him stories, introduced him to time. And in return, Enkidu gave her his wildness, willingly, naively. But something else grew in him, a feeling he'd never needed before, anger. Not the animal kind, the human kind. The kind born from injustice, from seeing power wielded carelessly. From hearing about Gilgamesh, this king who took what he wanted and called it divine right. That's the thing about civilization. It teaches you the names of your enemies. And now, Enkidu had one. He stormed toward Uruk, no longer beast, not yet man. A silhouette carved from contradiction. Muscles tensed, eyes burning with something newer than fire. He didn't come to conquer. He came to interrupt. And gods help whoever stood between him and the king. The city saw him first, a stranger with no lineage, no manners, no title. Just presence, just intent. And in a place where power dressed in gold and ritual, his rawness felt like thunder crashing through stained glass. When Gilgamesh heard, he laughed. Of course he did. This wild man, this feral footnote, dared to challenge him? Please, let the peasants have their hope. Let the animals send their ambassador. He welcomed the spectacle. Arrogance is always hungry for an audience. And so they met, not in a battlefield, but at a wedding. Because of course Gilgamesh was trying to sleep with another man's bride. And of course Enkidu decided that was the moment to step in. Drama respects timing. Their fight didn't start with words. They had none worth sharing. It began with breath, with muscle, with the deafening poetry of two forces colliding. The kind of fight that pauses time, that makes the gods sit forward in their seats, that echoes in the bones of cities. Stone cracked, crowds gasped, and the earth, usually neutral, held its breath. No one won. That's the truth no one likes to print on temple walls. Gilgamesh didn't crush him. Enkidu didn't humble him. What happened instead was stranger. Something broke, and something else bloomed. Respect. Not the kind born of fear, but the kind born of recognition. Two storms meeting and realizing neither one is leaving. A mirror looking back, not with mimicry, but with memory. Gilgamesh saw in Enkidu what he had never dared to become. And Enkidu saw in Gilgamesh what he had almost agreed to hate. And so they stopped. Panting, bleeding, laughing. Not enemies. Not yet brothers. Something in between. Something ancient and new. Something dangerous. A friendship that would change the world and tear it apart. There's a certain silence after a great storm, the kind that hums instead of echoes. That was the air around Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Two giants, both bruised and grinning, still vibrating with the memory of impact. The crowd held its breath, not sure whether to applaud or evacuate. But the two men? They laughed. Loud. Like wolves who'd found each other after chasing the same moon. No one quite understood it. One moment, fists flew like prophecy. The next, they were slapping each other on the back like drunk cousins at a funeral. Uruk had never seen anything like it. Two forces of nature clashing, and instead of canceling each other out, they harmonized. Something ancient shifted. Gilgamesh, who had never shared a crown, now found joy in sharing anything. Enkidu, who had just learned language, now spoke the dialect of brotherhood. They didn't need explanations. They needed action. And action, conveniently, was something Uruk never lacked. They became inseparable. Not in a soft, poetic way, in the way earthquakes and aftershocks travel together. They sparred for fun. They feasted like gods. They climbed statues they hadn't built. Together, they were chaos in royal robes. And the city, it adored them until it feared them. Because when two unchecked powers become best friends, the universe shifts uncomfortably in its seat. The gods, those meddling upper managers of myth, watched with narrowed eyes. Mortals weren't supposed to be this strong, or this happy, especially not when they started thinking for themselves. Gilgamesh, of course, grew restless. He always did. Power is a hunger that doesn't recognize satisfaction. He turned to Enkidu one wine-soaked evening and said, "Let's kill a god." Enkidu blinked. "Excuse me." "Humbaba," Gilgamesh grinned. "The forest guardian. The monster. The legend. Let's carve our names into the cedar trees with his bones." This is how you know you're dealing with legends. They treat danger like a brunch menu. Enkidu hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because he remembered. Unlike Gilgamesh, he knew the forest. He remembered its breath, its balance, its pulse. Humbaba wasn't just a monster. He was the boundary, the living no trespass sign between men and the sacred. But Gilgamesh, he saw myth as a ladder, and Humbaba was just one more rung to step on. And so, Enkidu agreed. Not out of loyalty, not out of ambition, but out of something messier, something human. He didn't want Gilgamesh to face the forest alone. They armed themselves, not just with weapons, but with confidence so thick it qualified as armor. The elders warned them. The priests begged. Even Gilgamesh's dreams turned dark and slippery. But when has prophecy ever stopped two idiots with adrenaline and matching outfits? They marched out of Uruk like a thunderstorm that hadn't decided where to strike yet. The people lined the streets, some cheering, others praying. The air felt heavier than usual, like the sky was holding its breath. Because everyone knew that slaying monsters wasn't about justice. It was about ego. And the gods don't like competition. Days passed in poetic discomfort. Forests grew denser. Night sounds got stranger. Even Gilgamesh's swagger dulled slightly. Enkidu, quiet now, walked like someone being watched, because they were. The closer they came to Humbaba's domain, the more the world began to notice them. And finally, there it was. The forest of cedars. Towering, ancient, indifferent. It didn't care for kings. It didn't care for quests. It existed before their names were carved into stone. It would exist after. But still, the two men entered, not with reverence, but with rhythm in their step. They called out the guardian, not with respect, with bravado, with volume, with the smug certainty of those who believe they're too important to die. And Humbaba responded. He didn't roar. He didn't scream. He arrived, like a curse, slow and inevitable. Breath of fire, eyes of storm, voice that split the trees like gossip splits a village. He wasn't just a beast. He was the forest. And the forest was very, very tired of being treated like scenery. The fight was messy, violent, holy in its ugliness. Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought like men who had forgotten how to retreat. They slashed, stumbled, screamed. Humbaba bled mountains. The trees wept. The wind begged them to stop. But they didn't. Because glory makes you deaf. Because kings mistake resistance for challenge. Because legends are built on things that shouldn't have been killed, and were. When Humbaba finally fell, it wasn't victory. It was vandalism. The forest quieted, but not in peace, in grief. And Enkidu, standing over the ruin, felt something crack inside him. Not bone, not guilt, something deeper, something prophetic. Gilgamesh smiled like a boy who just stole fire. "We did it," he whispered. "We made history." But the gods were watching, and history always wants something in return. There's a silence after killing something sacred, not the kind that soothes. The kind that stares back. The forest of cedars didn't die with Humbaba. It paused, held still, as if deciding whether to mourn or retaliate. The leaves hung heavy. The air thickened. Even the birds, those flighty narrators of old, refused to sing. Gilgamesh, of course, didn't notice. He was already posing. Chest out, chin up, holding Humbaba's severed head like a trophy on a magazine cover. To him, the silence wasn't warning. It was applause. But Enkidu felt it. in his bones, in the dirt, in the way the wind changed direction, not playfully, but as if recoiling. Something had shifted, something they couldn't undo. The forest, once his sibling, now smelled like betrayal, like grief on firewood. They chopped trees next, because when men win, they redecorate. Cedar after cedar fell like memories erased. Gilgamesh wanted wood for temples, for gates, for monuments to his ego. And what better way to celebrate killing a divine guardian than by turning his home into a lumber sale? Every axe swing echoed louder than it should have. Not in sound, in consequence. Because divine ecosystems don't take kindly to deforestation. Especially not when done with the smug rhythm of two men high on glory and bad decisions. They returned to Uruk like heroes, dragging trunks behind them, bathed in sap and arrogance. The people cheered, confused but loyal. Victory, after all, is rarely questioned when it arrives with souvenirs. They rebuilt temples. They engraved stories. They drank until memory blurred. But the gods didn't blur. The gods remember everything. And they weren't impressed. You see, Humbaba wasn't just a monster. He was a placeholder, a warning, a wall. Killing him was less about courage and more about dismantling boundaries that weren't meant to be crossed. Gilgamesh had broken the mythological equivalent of a cosmic do not touch sign. And the divine HR department had opened a ticket. Enter Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and the kind of chaos that shows up in perfume and leaves in lawsuits. She saw Gilgamesh, gleaming and drunk on fame, and she wanted him, not for his body, but for what his body represented: power, beauty, and total lack of emotional maturity. She offered marriage, lavish gifts, divine status, her version of a LinkedIn proposal. Gilgamesh, ever the charmer, declined brutally. He listed every one of her ex-lovers like a Yelp review gone wrong. Called her manipulative. Called her unhinged. Called her out in front of everyone. Now, rejecting a goddess is one thing. Mocking her to her face? That's suicide wearing cologne. Ishtar, scorned and seething, did what any sensible deity would do. She ran to her dad and demanded he release the bull of heaven. Because nothing says heartbreak like unleashing cosmic livestock on your ex's city. The bull arrived like a natural disaster. Hooves like earthquakes. Breath like plague. Each step devoured men. Each snort split the sky. It wasn't just destruction. It was theater. Ishtar sat back and waited for the lesson to begin. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu weren't done making mistakes. They fought it. Together. Brothers in bravado. Their teamwork poetic, violent, reckless. They stabbed, dodged, shouted, bled. And eventually, inevitably, they won. They killed the bull of heaven. And then they mocked Ishtar again. In public. Loudly. With creative insults. That was it. That was the final straw woven from divine patience and mortal stupidity. The gods gathered. Not for war. For judgment. Because this wasn't just disobedience. It was escalation. Two mortals had now killed a guardian of the forest and a beast of the heavens. They weren't just crossing lines. They were setting fire to them. Someone had to pay. But not Gilgamesh. Of course not. He was two-thirds god, wrapped in narrative armor, kissed by the authors of fate. No, the gods chose the other one. the one made of clay and breath, the one who never asked for fame, the one who only wanted to protect. They chose Enkidu, and somewhere, deep in the quiet that followed celebration, his body began to tremble. Not from illness, from inevitability, from the weight of a curse that didn't roar, it whispered. The price of glory had finally arrived, and this time, the axe would fall somewhere it hurt. Ishtar didn't scream. That would have been too mortal. She simply stood there, blood on her sandals, pride shattered like temple glass, and let her silence grow teeth. No god enjoys being humiliated, but a goddess? A goddess builds revenge like a cathedral. The bull of heaven lay dead in the dust, its ribcage open like an insult. Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood over it, triumphant, panting, drunk on their own myth. Around them, the city held its breath, unsure if it had witnessed salvation or suicide. Spoiler, it was both. Enkidu laughed. Loud. Loud enough for the heavens to hear. He picked up part of the bull's carcass, not to bury, not to mourn, but to hurl it at Ishtar like a punchline carved in meat. The crowd gasped. The goddess blinked. And the gods finally stood up. There's a difference between chaos and offense, between pushing the limits of fate and flipping the divine bird. Enkidu had crossed that line with muddy boots and no apology. The verdict came swiftly, not with thunder or decree, but with a sentence disguised as sickness. The dreams began first. Fevered, fragmented, the kind of visions that cling to your lungs. He saw gods with stone eyes, saw himself as clay again, melting. He saw the underworld's door swinging open without a sound. And worst of all, he saw nothing, just endless absence. His body followed, slowly, cruelly. A cough, a weight in the chest. Muscles that once danced with lions now twitched like forgotten instruments. Uruk tried to look away. Gilgamesh tried to fix it. But you can't unmake a curse with love. You can't negotiate with entropy. At first, Gilgamesh denied it. Heroes don't get sick. Not in his story. Not like this. He brought priests, herbs, prayers. None of it mattered. The gods weren't being subtle. This wasn't illness. This was an execution with flair. And Enkidu knew. He lay in bed, wrapped not in linens, but in regret. Not for the battle, not for the laughter, but for forgetting, even briefly, that death always comes with a receipt. That defiance feels like freedom until the silence starts knocking. His rage came next. Not at the gods, at himself, for letting go of the wild. For trading the forest's breath for city walls, for becoming civilized. He cursed Shamhat, the woman who brought him to humanity. He cursed Gilgamesh, the man who made him stay. He cursed the sky, the clay, the very idea of names. And then, finally, he wept. Not like a warrior, like a man. Like someone who tasted eternity for a second and realized it was bitter. Gilgamesh stayed by his side, helpless, desperate, stripped of all his swagger, watching his mirror, his brother, evaporate into myth. He held Enkidu's hand like it could anchor him to life. But even gods can't bribe the end. When Enkidu died, the world didn't crack. It sagged, as if something vital had been holding it upright, and now it tilted just enough to make balance feel impossible. Gilgamesh screamed, not to defy fate, but to remind himself he still had a voice. Uruk fell silent. No festivals, no parades, no declarations. Just one man dragging a corpse through the streets, crying louder than the priests, shaking harder than the walls he built. He wandered, for days, refusing burial, refusing closure, because to bury Enkidu would be to admit that even heroes rot, that even legends bleed out in rooms that smell of dust and desperation. The funeral, when it came, wasn't holy. It was furious. Gilgamesh built statues, burned offerings, cut his own hair, tore his clothes, not out of ritual, out of rebellion, as if mourning aggressively could bring him back. But the gods? They stayed silent, because grief isn't a bug in the system. It's the system. And now, Gilgamesh finally felt it. The fear, the smallness, the mortality. He wasn't 2/3 God anymore. He was 100% alone. And that was the true curse. Not the loss. The reminder that everything, even the invincible, ends. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Heroes weren't supposed to cry. Kings weren't supposed to collapse. Gods weren't supposed to feel small. But there he was, Gilgamesh, the golden lion of Uruk, curled beside a corpse that wouldn't blink back. Enkidu was gone. Not disappeared. Not faded. Gone. The kind of gone that clings to your clothes. That rewrites the silence in every room. That makes sunlight feel accusatory. His body remained, sculpted muscle now soft with stillness. But his breath, his fire, his wildness had slipped into the dust. Gilgamesh didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't blink much. He wandered the walls of Uruk like a ghost in his own city, searching for something he couldn't name. His crown sat untouched, his throne cold. The city watched him unravel with the discomfort of people seeing their god become a man. Grief turned him inside out. He shouted at priests, punched mirrors, tore open scrolls looking for answers that were never written. What was the point of strength if it couldn't hold a hand? What was the point of divinity if it couldn't outlive heartbreak? He began to fear what he couldn't kill. Not monsters. Not curses. Time. Time was the real enemy. It took his friend. It would take him. And that was unacceptable. He started to smell like the wilderness again. Hair uncut. Feet blistered. Eyes hollowed out by insomnia and fury. People whispered that the king had lost his mind. But the truth was worse. He'd found it. And it was terrified. One night, in the same bed where Enkidu had died, Gilgamesh whispered a decision that would change everything. I will find the one who does not die. Immortality, not in poems, not in marble, real, untouchable, permanent. His advisors pleaded. His priests protested. You're still young. You're still strong. But he didn't hear them. He heard the silence, the one that used to be filled with laughter. And so, he left Uruk, left the city he built, the people he ruled, the myth he'd become. He walked barefoot into the wilderness, not as a king, not even as a warrior, but as a question. A breathing question in search of an answer no god was willing to give. He crossed deserts, mountains, waded through rivers thick with silt and sorrow. Every path he took whispered Enkidu's name. Every tree looked like the ones they cut. Every night, he dreamed of the underworld, and woke up choking on dread. He met people, strange ones, old ones. Some offered food, others offered warnings, but all of them looked at him the same way, like someone who had come too far to turn back and not far enough to survive. Some told him to stop. The gods made death for a reason, they said. Even immortality has fine print. But Gilgamesh wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for escape. He heard of a man, older than time, they said, a relic from the flood, a survivor of divine wrath, Utnapishtim, the one who outlived the end of the world. If anyone had cheated death, it was him. Gilgamesh set his sights on that name like a man crawling toward a mirage. But every step hurt, not from the road, from remembering. The way Enkidu had walked beside him. The jokes, the silence, the bond that needed no ceremony. Every footprint reminded him that immortality wasn't just about living, it was about not losing. And now, he realized, that was the real fear. Not death, loneliness. He slept under stars that refused to speak, drank from streams that tasted like shame, and in the quietest moments, the ones between dreams and morning, he almost heard Enkidu's voice. Not mocking, not angry, just there. It haunted him, comforted him, drove him forward, because even in death, Enkidu was more real than any god. Gilgamesh, who had once mocked the limits of men, was now begging to outrun them. Not for power, not for glory, for the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to say goodbye again. But the gods were watching, and they were smiling, because no one escapes the design, not even the ones who helped carve it. Maps don't show this part, not because it doesn't exist, but because existence here is optional. Gilgamesh had crossed from kingdom into whisper, from empire into erosion. The land ahead didn't welcome him. It tolerated him, like an old scar tolerates weather. He walked until the sky forgot his name, until his feet forgot the concept of comfort, until hunger felt philosophical. His crown was long gone, his armor traded for sunburn and cracked fingernails. The once god of Uruk now resembled a mad prophet who had eaten prophecy and choked on the meaning. Then came the mountains. Not majestic, not poetic, brutal. Stone stacked on stone like the world's grudge. At their edge stood creatures, part scorpion, part timekeeper, guarding the entrance to something older than consequence. They didn't kill him. They looked at him. And sometimes, that's worse. Why do you come here, mortal? To escape death, Gilgamesh rasped, voice dry as dust. One of them blinked slowly. Everyone says that. No one does. Still, they let him pass. Maybe because they were bored. Maybe because they knew what was ahead. The tunnel. No light. No sound. Just blackness thick enough to chew. A corridor of forever. Gilgamesh stumbled forward, arms outstretched, trusting nothing and touching everything. He tripped over his fear, slammed into his own regrets. Time stopped checking on him. 12 leagues of night. No stars, no gods, just Gilgamesh and Gilgamesh, the worst traveling companion. And then, light, soft, unapologetic. The tunnel ended, not with revelation, but with Sidui. A woman, a tavern keeper, standing by the sea, polishing cups like the apocalypse was running late. She didn't gasp, didn't bow. She looked at the filthy, broken man and asked if he was lost. Which, to be fair, was the most generous interpretation. Gilgamesh demanded answers, demanded direction, demanded immortality. Sidui poured him wine instead. She told him the truth, not gently, but plainly. That humans die, that the gods built it that way, that chasing forever is the fastest path to forgetting how to live at all. He didn't like that answer. Kings rarely do. But she didn't care. She'd seen 1,000 men with crowns and none of them knew how to sit still. Gilgamesh wasn't special, just loud. Still, she pointed him toward a boatman, Urshanabi, who might ferry him to the end of the world. But first, of course, there was paperwork. A test. A ritual. Something annoyingly symbolic. Gilgamesh smashed the stone charms, ruined the boat. Typical. So now they had to cut down trees, again, to make new oars. Yes, even after all that, he was still deforesting. Some lessons stick slower than others. Eventually, with enough logs and existential fatigue, they set sail. Across the waters of death, a place so sacred, even the gods whispered when passing through. No waves, no wind, just a sea made of silence and endings. At last, they reached the other shore, and there, ancient, quiet, retired from the myth business, stood Utnapishtim, the man who didn't die, the original survivor. The one who had watched the world drown and didn't flinch. Gilgamesh fell to his knees, asked for the secret, begged for it, promised to be worthy. Utnapishtim sighed like someone who had heard every version of this plea for the last several thousand years. He didn't answer with formulas. He answered with a story, a flood, sent by gods tired of the noise. Waters rising, humanity gasping, and only one man chosen to build a boat. Sound familiar? Of course it does. Myth recycles everything. The flood cleansed. The man lived. But it wasn't a reward. It was a curse. Everyone he knew was gone. Eternity, it turns out, is just loneliness with really good skin. You want to live forever? Utnapishtim asked. Why? Gilgamesh didn't have an answer, just eyes that hadn't blinked in days. So the old man offered a test. Stay awake for 7 nights. Prove you're worthy. Gilgamesh agreed, and fell asleep within minutes. Utnapishtim didn't gloat. He just covered him with bread. A loaf for each day. Let time speak for itself. When Gilgamesh awoke, he lied. I didn't sleep. The moldy loaves said otherwise. So much for worthiness. But still, the old man took pity, told him of a plant, a secret root that could renew youth, hidden beneath the sea, painful to find, impossible to keep. Naturally, Gilgamesh dove for it, and found it. Of course he did, because some quests succeed just long enough to become ironic. Plant in hand, he began the journey home. Not triumphant, tired, but in his heart, hope. Quiet, fragile, dangerous. He stopped to bathe, left the plant beside him. A snake slithered up, stole it, and vanished. Just like that. Immortality, gone. Stolen by something that didn't even need it. Gilgamesh stood there, wet, defeated, holding nothing. And for the first time, he didn't scream. He didn't punch the earth. He didn't blame the gods. He just sat down. Because some lessons aren't shouted. They're absorbed. There's something quietly cruel about losing something you never really had. The plant of eternal youth, a spiny, ugly thing with magic in its marrow, had rested in Gilgamesh's hands for all of a morning. Long enough to imagine. Not long enough to become. And then came the snake. It didn't roar. Didn't offer riddles. It slithered up like disappointment on a Tuesday, tasted immortality, and slid away. As if the gods, having watched him climb mountains and cross seas, had saved the most ridiculous defeat for last. Gilgamesh didn't chase it. That's the part that stings the most. He didn't shout, didn't draw his sword. He just stood there, naked beside a stream, watching eternity disappear in a ribbon of scales. Maybe for the first time, he understood that the end isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just taken from you when your back is turned. He sat for hours, maybe days. The water kept flowing, indifferent. The wind moved around him like a bored narrator. There were no omens, no divine commentary, just the taste of salt and regret and the soft hum of something ending. Because that's the trick, isn't it? The gods never say no. They let you get close. Close enough to see the shimmer. Close enough to smell the promise. But not close enough to hold it. Immortality, it turns out, is the most divine of pranks. And yet, something shifted in him. The anger didn't return. The pride didn't reawaken. What came instead was a strange softness. Not weakness. Peace. Not the kind he'd prayed for. The kind that comes after the crying stops, when your ribs still ache but the silence doesn't bite as hard. He turned home. Not with fanfare. Not with followers. Just footprints in the dust. Each step lighter. Not because the burden was gone, but because he had stopped trying to carry everything. On the way back, he passed the same deserts, the same rivers. But they didn't feel the same. The world hadn't changed. He had. Even the mountains, once gods in stone, now just looked like rocks. Tall, yes, but not immortal. When he arrived at Uruk, no trumpet sounded. The gates opened not for a king, but for a man who had finally learned the value of limits. The people didn't cheer. They watched. Quietly. The way you watch someone who left with questions and came back with scars instead of answers. Gilgamesh stood before the walls he once bragged about. And this time, he really looked at them. Not as monuments. As memory. These bricks, this city, this kingdom, this was what he had built. Not to outlive death, but to give life shape, to hold stories, to protect the fragile thing he had spent so long trying to escape, mortality. He didn't mention Enkidu. He didn't have to. Every step in that city echoed with his absence. Every breeze that hit the palace windows carried his name in a language only grief understands. The loss didn't fade. It simply settled, became part of the architecture. He called for scribes, not to write his victories, but to tell the truth. The whole thing, the arrogance, the friendship, the forest, the gods, the plant, the loss, the real journey. And they wrote, on tablets, with styluses, word by word, breath by breath, not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he wanted others to remember why. Because the real immortality was never in magic plants. It was in story, in echo, in a tale retold by candlelight long after the body's gone cold. He stopped chasing gods, stopped mocking them, stopped needing them to explain everything. And maybe, in that surrender, he became more divine than ever. Because divinity, real divinity, isn't power. It's presence. Gilgamesh ruled well after that. Not perfectly, but with more listening, less thunder. He walked his city like someone who knew it could crumble, who respected that, who feared that, but didn't let fear make him cruel. Sometimes, late at night, he'd look at the stars and smile. Not with longing, with recognition. He knew now they didn't owe him anything, and he didn't owe them silence. He would die, like all men, but his words, his grief, his learning, that would stay, not forever, but long enough. Uruk had changed, or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it was always this quiet, and only now could Gilgamesh hear it. The cobbled streets no longer echoed with his triumphs. They simply echoed. The temple bells rang, not for conquest, but for continuity. And the people, they looked at him differently now. Not up, across. He had returned not as the king who left, but as the man the journey had carved out of stone. His shoulders sagged in ways that armor couldn't explain. His hands no longer reached for swords, they reached for meaning. And for the first time in recorded mythology, a ruler walked into his palace without announcing it. He spent days alone in the archives, staring at the tablets. Not just the ones about him, the ones about everyone. Old laws, forgotten names. He read them not as commands, but as questions. What had he missed while chasing the stars? What had he ignored in his sprint toward forever? He didn't rebuild statues. He didn't throw feasts. He sat with children, listened to farmers, walked the outer walls in the morning, where the bricks still held the fingerprints of those who laid them. He began to see his city not as a kingdom, but as a collaboration. And yet, every night, he dreamed of Enkidu. Not in anguish, not anymore, but in memory. The laugh, the wildness, the terrible, beautiful mistake of becoming mortal together. Sometimes they said nothing, just sat in the reeds of some remembered river, watching time flow past without apology. The dreams became his scripture. He had his scribes write them down. Every line, every error, every moment of failure and doubt and silence. Not as warning, but as witness. Because somewhere along the way, he realized the truth. That a legacy built on conquest turns to dust. But a legacy built on confession? That lingers. He wandered his palace like a man visiting a museum of his younger self. The throne looked smaller now, the gold less impressive. The echoes of his old arrogance still clung to the columns, but he no longer responded to them. When people asked him what he had learned, he never gave them the whole story. He let them read it, let them feel it, because transformation isn't a speech. It's an ache, a slow rewiring. The gods had denied him eternity, but in doing so, they gave him truth. And the truth was this, that greatness is not avoiding death. It's what you leave behind when it comes. He spent the rest of his reign quietly, not invisible, not passive, just measured. He built gardens instead of towers, encouraged poetry over war, Not because he had gone soft, but because he had gone deep. There's a difference. He still wore a crown, but now it felt borrowed, temporary, a reminder that power doesn't belong to those who seize it, but to those who understand when to release it. He aged, slowly, imperceptibly, one wrinkle at a time, one soft nod in court, one forgotten weapon gathering dust. The people didn't notice until one morning they looked up and realized the Lion of Uruk was now a man made of memory. And yet, there was peace in that, because Gilgamesh had built something, not just walls or temples, but story, a shape for the chaos, a voice for the silence, a script for those who would one day ask the same questions he had screamed into the void. And the city, it didn't mourn, it remembered, because some men build empires to escape death. Others build meaning, so that death has something to walk away from. And when he was gone, finally, fully, Uruk didn't erupt in grief. It kept going, quietly, softly, the way life always does, when the story is told well enough to outlive its narrator. They didn't build him a shrine. They didn't light the sky with fire. There was no celestial ceremony, just a room that grew quieter one morning than it had the day before. Gilgamesh didn't vanish in glory. He faded, like sun-warmed stone cooling after dusk. One breath less, one whisper quieter. And when the last servant noticed the stillness, there was no panic, only reverence, as if even death had arrived gently, finally understanding that it was dealing not with a god, but with someone who had earned being human. No one knew what to say, not at first. What do you say when the man who outran storms, fought monsters, insulted gods, and buried his own immortality, simply stops? So they Saturday, with the silence, with the space he left behind, with the comfort that he hadn't burned everything on the way out. The scribes continued writing. The gardeners continued tending. Children still shouted in the market, oblivious to the myth quietly crumbling into history. And that was the point. Gilgamesh hadn't been trying to live forever. Not anymore. He'd been trying to make sure that something did. Something more useful than his name. They placed his body in stone. Not to trap him, but to anchor the memory. Not as a monument, but as a pause. A way for the living to remember what it feels like to change without noise. To grow without applause. The gods, for once, remained silent. Not in anger, in respect, because even they knew he had played the part they never could. He had been adored and feared. He had conquered and collapsed. He had raged against limits and then accepted them. He had lived long enough to see that greatness wasn't in defeating death. It was in leaving behind something that didn't need to. In the centuries that followed, his story traveled farther than his armies ever did. Across deserts, carved into stone, translated, copied, misunderstood, reimagined, but always retold, because something in it, something in him, refused to be forgotten. Not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. He had failed, repeatedly, grandly, publicly, and still, he had stayed. That's the part that mattered. That's what outlived him. Not the monster fights or the stolen plants or the walls of Uruk, but the fact that, when everything broke, he stayed. He felt. He learned. In a world that celebrates noise, he had finally chosen stillness. In a myth built on glory, he had chosen humility. And in a story obsessed with immortality, he had chosen to end. Not with regret, with intention. Because the truest kind of legacy is not the one that refuses to die. It's the one that teaches others how to live. And so, somewhere, maybe in the dust of ruins, maybe in the footnotes of tablets, his voice still lingers. Not shouting, not preaching, just whispering. You don't have to conquer the world. You just have to stay long enough to understand it. So if you've made it this far, past the gods, the monsters, the deserts, the grief, maybe that's the real journey. Not Gilgamesh's. Yours. Maybe you've chased something too. Maybe you've buried a name. Fought your own humbaba. Mocked a few gods. Waited too long for a plant that never came back. But you're still here. Breathing. Becoming. Choosing presence instead of perfection. And maybe, like Gilgamesh, you've realized, it's not about escaping death. It's about making peace with life. So rest now. Not because the story ends, but because you don't have to outrun it anymore. Just close your eyes. Let the myth fade. Let the silence hold you. And remember, you were never meant to be immortal, only unforgettable.